And I also just really appreciate you all being here today. It is, kind of goes without saying, it's a really difficult time in the world for democracies. And my guess is that some of you may be here because you're obligated to come for class, but a lot of you are here because you share concerns with me and with many other people about where are we going, what are we doing to each other, what are we doing with each other, and how might we do democracy better. So I want to start off with a picture that's probably more familiar to you than to me. These are returns from your gubernatorial race last week, and it's now kind of standard practice to notice how different vote returns are in urban areas versus rural areas in the U.S. And those of you who are students of politics have been watching this stuff for some time know that it's not just a correlation that's going on here between partisanship and type of place, meaning it's not just that there's something in the water, for example, that makes folks in urban areas vote for Democrats and folks in rural areas vote for Republicans these days, but it's a complex set of relationships. It's partly about culture, it's partly about information networks, partly about social networks. It's about a lot of things. And basically that's what I'm going to speak to today is what's going on primarily in rural areas, but I want to tell you the story of how I got to studying that type of thing, because I wasn't looking for a rural versus urban divide. But 10 years ago, I was sprinting for tenure, and I decided to, I told myself that if I earn tenure at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, I am going to do my dream study, which is studying how social class identity matters for the way people interpret politics. And I'm going to use my backyard, the state of Wisconsin, as my window, because I grew up in Wisconsin. You can probably tell from the way I talk. I love the state of Wisconsin, and I wanted to design a study that gave me a good excuse to go out and about around the state of Wisconsin. The thing that I've always studied, basically across the course of my career, is how people interpret politics, how they make sense of politics. Because oftentimes in the study of public opinion or political behavior, we find ourselves asking this question of why do people vote against their interests? Or sometimes it's put in less charitable terms as, how can people be so stupid, right? Why do people make the choices that they do? And I like to ask not that question, but instead a different one, which is, not, sorry, I gotta remember to point at my computer, not how can people be so stupid or what are they getting wrong, but instead, how are they getting it? How are they understanding their world? And given that, how does that influence the way they think about politics? So I had learned by 2007, I had already been a professor for about 7 years at that point, I had learned that the best way for me to get at this question of how are people interpreting politics, how are they understanding their world, was to listen to folks. Talk with one another in the places that they normally spend time, talking to the people that they normally talk to. And, listen to the way, the kind of the tools that they're using, the different things that they refer to carve up the world. So back in 2007, I'm designing this study in which I want to get out and about around the state of Wisconsin. I want to see how social class identity works for people, how their sense of where they are in the grand scheme of things matters for how they're interpreting politics. So what I did was, and this is just in case you don't know where Wisconsin is. When I give a talk on the coast, I like to show this slide. So anyway, there's Wisconsin. So what I did was to take Wisconsin and I carved it up into different regions depending on political leanings, type of industry, type of agriculture, population density, different ethnic and racial characteristics, a few other things, and then in each of those regions I sampled a few places. I ended up with these 27 communities, and what I did once I had sampled these 27 was to call up a local newspaper editor or a local university extension office. So there's 72 counties in Wisconsin, and in each county there's a UW extension office, which is an arm of the university system. And those folks know their communities really well. Can you hear me okay? Okay, just wave in the back if you can. Okay. And I would say to those folks, so I've sampled, such and such Wisconsin. do you know of a place there where people get together on a regular basis that I might get access to? And sometimes they didn't quite know what I was talking about. Sometimes they would say, oh yeah, totally, Joe's Gas and Sip. Every morning, 5:30 a.m., there's a group of people meeting there. Just, yeah, they'll be there every weekday morning. So here are some pictures. There are some pictures that are going to roll by of different places that I spent time in. So starting in 2007, I invited myself into these places. My fieldwork got extended because of events in the state and in the world that made me want to know more, learn more. So between 2007 and 2012, I was inviting myself into conversations in these places. And then when my book came out, the book is called The Politics of Resentment. Not that I'm trying to sell you copies, but that helps. Anyway, I'm trying to sell you copies. When it came out, I went back around to a lot of these groups to give them a copy of my book, but also because the presidential campaign was in full swing and I was really interested to hear what people were saying. So when I knew that, say, every morning this is a place that's a town hall in a small community in northern Wisconsin. Every morning, I forget when they meet, I think it's 6:30, there's a group of folks who get together around the Mr. Coffee and have really bad coffee and share the news, and then they go on with their day. I would drive out from Madison, stay at the closest Super 8 usually, and then get up in the morning, drive over there, take a deep breath, walk in and say, hi, I'm Kathy from the University of Wisconsin. Do you mind if I join you this morning? They would look at me like, no problem, sit down, or pull up a chair, pull up a stool, or we've got nothing better to do, why not? And then I would say, well, here's a token of my appreciation, either a pen or a pad of Post-it notes or a football schedule. And then someone would say, are my taxpayer dollars paying for this? And I'd say, no, they're donated by the Alumni Association. I'd give them my business card so they knew how to contact me if they ever, if mad or wanted to know more, whatever. And then I would ask if I could turn on my digital recorder, it's a little bit bigger than this. And over time, I started using my iPhone because honestly, the memo recorder, voice memo recorder, is as good as my digital recorder was 10 years ago. But having an obvious digital recorder in the middle of the table does a lot for me in terms of just being very clear about the fact that I am collecting and studying. And then I would say, so tell me, what are your concerns? What are your big concerns around here? What are you all talking about these days? And we would go from there. Now, I had sampled communities across the state, some urban, some suburban, some rural, small towns. I wasn't necessarily looking to compare, looking for a rural versus urban divide, but it was obvious a good 9 months, a year into my study, that what I was hearing in these smaller places and in the small towns was really a surprise to me. And it was intense, and it sounded very similar, regardless of whether I was in the northwest corner of the state or the southwest, or it sounded very similar across the rural areas. And it's this thing that I call rural consciousness and a resentment toward the cities, which I'm going to describe for you a bit. And then I'm going to talk about how it has mattered for politics in Wisconsin, how I think it has mattered for the 2016 presidential election, and then how it's mattered globally. And then I promise I'll leave ample times for your thoughts and questions, okay? So here's this thing that I call rural consciousness. People, when I ask folks in these smaller towns, tell me about your concerns, the way they were describing what they were concerned about, in general had this tone of, we are not getting our fair share. And first what they were saying to me is, look, Kathy, there's the state of Wisconsin, which here's the map. And they're saying to me, look, there's Madison, which is the state capital where my university is, and there's Milwaukee, which is the main industrial center in the state. And those are the two metropolitan areas, like the only two metropolitan areas in the state. And then they were saying, and then there's the rest of us, all this other stuff out here. So this map is probably, I should get a better map because the type size does not correspond to size of the cities here. These other cities mentioned out here range in size, like Eagle River, I forget, it's like 4,000 people in the summer. It's pretty small. Wausau is a bit bigger, but anyway, these are the metro areas. Chicago's is down here. The Twin Cities, Minneapolis and St. Paul are up here. And what they were saying to me is like, there's the M&Ms, then there's the rest of us. So they had a kind of a mental map of the state in their mind. And on this mental map, they were saying that map explains who gets attention, who gets stuff, money, resources, and who gets respect. So they were saying, you know, all the decisions are made down in Madison or in Milwaukee, and they're communicated outward to the rest of us. And there aren't people coming out here to ask us, what are you concerned about? Tell me what you're talking about these days. And we're not participating in the decisions. We don't have political power, is one way you might put it. They were also saying we don't get our fair share of resources because it seems to us that Madison sucks in all of our taxpayer dollars, spends that money on itself or on Milwaukee, and our communities don't see it in return. We don't get it back. We don't get our fair share back, at least. And then they were also saying, finally, and I think this may be most important in light of the 2016 presidential election, we don't get our fair share of respect because those folks making the decisions, whether we're talking about elites in government or in the corporate sector or in the healthcare industry or in banking, what have you, they don't know us. They've never spent time in a place like this, a real time, like they come to vacation, but they've never lived here. They don't understand what life is like, and they think we're stupid and that we're uneducated and we're sexist and racist and homophobic and Islamophobic. They don't like us. All of that together is what I call rural consciousness, which is both this identity as a person from a small town or a rural place, combined with this sense of distributive injustice, or this sense that we don't get our fair share. Now, when I say it's an identity with the rural place, they're not saying to me, I identify as a rural person, right? That's not how it comes across in conversation. Instead, it's things like people around here, people like us, or you people in the cities. You know what I mean? Like, you get it that way. People don't often use the term like, I'm a rural person. And in this, that sense of distributive injustice are these three parts again that came out most loudly. It was both the attention and the resources and the respect. All of that is what I mean when I refer to resentment. And I think it's powerful because there are so many different facets or layers to this. Meaning, it's resentment towards cities and city people, right? But it's resentment towards elites of the different types I've described, whether it's higher education or government or other sectors of life. It's also resentment increasingly towards a particular political party, and it's resentment towards racial minorities, without a doubt. In Wisconsin, you may know it's a heavily racially segregated state, and it's not just, I mean, like many places, Wisconsin has a pretty horrible history with respect to relationships between whites and people of color. So we're heavily segregated geographically, racially, but we also have 12 Native American reservations in Wisconsin, 11 that are federally recognized, and most of those places are in more rural areas. And we have a pretty horrible history in Wisconsin with respect to the treatment of Native Americans. So when people are talking about those people in the cities, sometimes they're talking about racial minorities, right? But what I want you to notice is how there's the many different facets of this means that people can tap into one part of it. They can be talking about the Democratic Party, or they can be talking about you all down at the university, talking about elites. And that can invoke or ignite resentment towards racial minorities too. So that's part of what gives the steam. Okay, well, how did this matter politically? I'm going to spell out first, before introducing any actual political event, how this perspective sets the stage for a savvy politician to tap into. So one is, it goes without saying a bit, that it's very fertile ground for divisive messages. Because what people are saying to me is, look, we are not getting our fair share, and we deserve more. And it seems to us that we're working super hard to make ends meet. right? We're busting our backs, and it seems like the stuff we deserve is going to people who don't deserve it. More often than not, I heard that with respect to me or people like me. So when I started my field work back in 2007, this is before the Great Recession, right? Even then, people were saying to me, look, how is this supposed to work? Kathy, you state employee, I work for a public university. You have your summers off, you have health care, you have a salary that's like whatever, twice, 3 times, 4 times the size of my salary, and you don't seem to be working very hard. Like, you're driving around the state having coffee with us? How is that a job? How is that hard work, right? And you're telling me I'm supposed to pay higher taxes so that you can have health care when I can't even afford it for my own family? How is this supposed to work, right? So you can see how it's, it's going to set the stage for someone to come in and say, you're right. They should pay more into the pot, right? Okay. Another way it sets the stage for divisive messages is that a lot of times the story that people are telling me is, my community used to be thriving. It used to be the case that someone like me, my parents, my grandparents' generation, could do the same job I'm doing in this same place and have a really good standard of life. They used to be able to afford to live on the lake. They used to be able to have a boat, right? And health care. And something has happened. Someone has taken that quality of life away. Someone or something or some group of people, right? And another way of putting this is like our status. So, for example, our working class white folk status used to be the case. That kind of meant a ticket to a decent quality of life. It's not the case anymore. We're not getting the respect and the stuff that we think we deserve. Another thing that it sets the stage for is someone to really want to make a big change to government, because people are saying to me, look around you, like look out the window of the cafe or wherever, like whatever government is doing is not working for people like us, right? And oftentimes people are talking about government as an urban entity. So even though on average in Wisconsin, 10% of the workforce works for a government, whether it's local or county or state, and sometimes federal, but they're very few. People are perceiving that the way those folks are doing their jobs are according to urban values and urban decisions. So for example, public school teachers sometimes have lived in the community all their lives or multiple decades, and yet people are perceiving that their unions and the way they do their jobs are driven by decisions people are making downstate in Madison, or heaven forbid in Washington, D.C., right? Same with Department of Natural Resource folks. So these are, I can tell you more about attitudes towards the DNR, but on balance, really negative. People feeling like these folks are over-regulating our life and they don't really know anything about our life. And they don't know actually anything about the bass fishing, because I can tell you I bass fish every day, and I can tell you whether bass are spawning in the same place or not. Anyway, so government is seen as an urban thing, and people are feeling, the people in government don't like us, don't know us. So Wisconsin, I call bellwether state in many ways. This is Scott Walker, who is our governor now. He was elected in 2010. And shortly after he was elected governor, he's a Republican, he proposed a piece of budget legislation that's called Act 10. And what this legislation did was to eliminate most collective bargaining for most public employee unions. It really was a big blow to public unions in the state and public employees, because it decimated public employee unions, and it also required public employees to pay in a whole lot more from their paychecks for their health care and pension benefits. So this was the response in Wisconsin. And I know you might not be able to see this, but basically massive protests, day after day, sleeping overnight in the Capitol, thousands and thousands of people for a good 6 weeks plus. If you drove 20 minutes out of Madison, the response was different. The response was, it's about time. It's about time. Good for that, Scott Walker, because those public employees have had it really good for a long time, and it's about time they start paying more of their fair share. Okay, 2016. How did this work for Donald Trump? Super different politician than Scott Walker in many ways. And yet he tapped into these perceptions in his own unique way. Briefly, you know, this was a politician who was selling people an overnight change in federal government, right? From draining the swamp to using Hillary Clinton as his foil, right? To use her as like a symbol of Washington, D.C., federal government in general, right? That slogan of lock her up was about many things. I don't want to downplay the sexism, but it was partly about, you know, we don't want any more of this. You want what I'm going to bring, which is an overnight change in Washington, D.C. Finally, the Trump campaign has really brought to light just how tapping into how it's possible to not speak to the better part of ourselves, right? When people are feeling, no one's listening to me, I deserve more, I'm not getting my fair share, has shown us just how possible it is to mobilize people by saying, you're right, and you know what, it's their fault, and giving people really concrete targets of blame. The targets that Scott Walker gave Wisconsinites were primarily public employees. There's a few others to throw in the mix. But the targets that Donald Trump have given us are immigrants, Muslims, right? Racial minorities, birtherism, right? I mean, he got a lot of our attention years ago through this argument that the President of the United States was not actually even eligible to be President of the United States, right? And there are just some serious racial undertones there. His immigration policies, the Muslim ban, the ban against transgendered people serving in the military, in all these ways, he's tapping into a really, you know, really problematic side of people's resentment. Now, is this tapping into exclusive to people in rural areas? No, and I don't mean to be arguing that. But what I want to say is that when people after the election turned to me and said, how can it be that, you know, Wisconsin was one of the kind of the key states in the 2016 election. So the next day when people called me up and said, how can it be that the good people in the state of Wisconsin can vote for Donald Trump? I was able to say, look, like people are wanting a lot of people are wanting some drastic change, and there's an appetite for the types of arguments that he was selling. I'm not going to beat a dead horse here. All right. So finally, this slogan of Make America Great Again. When I was describing people's sense of it used to be the case that people like me had it really good, I think that this slogan, that theme, really taps into that. Really taps into that notion of something has gone off for people like me. Somewhere along the line, people stopped giving me what I think I deserve, giving me the attention, giving me the respect. And it was pretty powerful. So here is the returns by county from the 2016 presidential election. So blue areas went Democratic, red areas went Republican. So this map may be familiar to you. It looks a lot like your map of Virginia and the gubernatorial returns from last week, right? Urban areas, much more blue. But here's another map I want to show you to point out that this is not a new phenomenon. This is not a 2016 thing. This is a map that shows you the shift over time between 1996 and 2016 in presidential returns. So for the last 20 years, there has been increasingly a shift of our urban areas to the Democratic Party and our rural areas to the Republican Party. Now you might also be saying, yeah, but hasn't there always been a distinction between rural and urban areas in how people vote? Yes, I mean, you can point back to 1896, for example, and see a similar kind of divide. But there's something in our contemporary history that has meant increasingly this kind of partisan polarization along geographic lines, which has brought us to the present day. It's not just the US though. So the UK in the Brexit vote, you see similar kind of divides between London seems like an island unto itself with a few other parts of England, and the more rural areas were predominantly voted in favor of Brexit or leaving the European Union. Same thing has happened in the French election. So Emmanuel Macron got the bulk of his support from Paris and the more urban areas, and Marine Le Pen did really well in the northern rural parts of France. You could also see the same in recent elections in Germany, although it's greatly complicated by the fact that Eastern Germany was disproportionately likely to vote for the AfD or their kind of authoritarian populist party. So I point this out to say it's helpful for us to understand what's going on here in Virginia, in the US, by knowing that it's part of a more global thing going on in industrialized democracies. And oftentimes you hear the word populism talked about these days, right, which is the label that is getting put on Trump supporters. And that is, I won't complicate things too much by going into what populism is or isn't, but in general, there's been a growing support. I should be more careful about that. It's not clear whether it's increase in public opinion for populism, meaning the idea that the people, a certain construction of the people is good, the government is bad, or whether it's an increase in the candidates or parties running on a populist platform. And we can talk more about that later. But we know for sure that there is greater success in recent years, in the last 2-3 years, of populist parties and populist candidates. So then this question comes up of, okay, so is it economics or is it culture, or economics or is it racism? I want to spend a little bit of time talking about that. And actually, before I do that though, I should do something that's more important, and that is to give you a snapshot of what these attitudes that I've been describing sound like in people's own terms. So I've been describing it and describing the effects, but let me share with you what these actually sound like, and I'm going to try and make you laugh at least once. Okay, so what I want to do is just share with you a few snippets of conversations that I recorded in Wisconsin to just give you a better sense of what rural resentment sounded like as it was coming across in conversations. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go like this when it's me talking, and I'm going to use my hands like this when it's other people talking, so I don't interrupt the flow of the conversation. So this first snippet is from a group of women that meet once a week for breakfast mid-morning in the far northwest corner of Wisconsin, very rural place. It's a real heavily tourist town. Most of the women in this group have lived there their whole, well, it's a mix of people who've lived their whole lives, or they've moved back in retirement, or they moved to the place some years ago. There's some business owners, some people who are retired, some former public school teachers, wide range, but it's all women. And I'm asking them, this is in, I think it's 2008. I'm asking them about the University of Wisconsin-Madison, because partly what I was doing is asking folks about their attitudes toward the university. So I'm asking them, what do you think we do not so well? Well, like I've asked them, what do you think we do well? What do you think we do not so well? As a former educator, I resented highly comments such as, there is no education north of Highway 8. So Highway 8 is an east-west highway in the state that runs about like the top third of the state. These kids, we send them such absolutely excellent and well-prepared students there that the attitude that we are the hick area of the state, it was painful. So who did you get that from? From professors? Who'd you get that from? From recruiters? No, professors. Really? When they would visit? Or publish in newspaper articles or other, and that was a little distressful, because I think northern Wisconsin feels a little far away from Madison anyway. And we keep waving our hands and saying, yoo-hoo, there's another half of a state up here. Up north is not Wausau. Wausau is that city I pointed out in the middle of the state, right? Here's another example. This is men and women. These are folks who are meeting in the basement of a church because there's no gas station in this town. It's so small, there's not even a gas station. So folks know that the gathering place is the basement of this church, and it happens once a week. People come from all over. Some people are members of the congregation, some people aren't, and some stay-at-home moms, some farmers depending on the season, some business owners, some retirees. There's sometimes young kids, who aren't in school yet. Range of people, men and women, girls and boys. I'm asking about the university again. What do you think the University of Wisconsin-Madison does not do well? When you think about it, it represents our area. I mean, we're strange to Madison. They want us to do everything for Madison's laws and the way they do things, but we totally live differently than the city people live. So they need to think more rural instead of all this city area. We can't afford to educate our children like they can in the cities. Simple as that. We don't have the advantages. All the things they do based on Madison and Milwaukee, never us. Yeah, we don't have the advantages that they give their local people there, I think, a lot of times. And it's probably because they don't understand how rural people live and what we deal with in our problems. Okay, one final example. So there was one town, the one that I kind of circled the laser around, more central west Wisconsin, one of the lowest income counties in the state, really rural. I had sampled this town and I could not find a group of regulars. I was having a really hard time until someone said to me, well, there is the dice game. I said, the dice game? Yeah, but you're gonna need someone to walk you back there. I'm like, walk me back there? So there's a diner on the main street, and if someone tells you, that at the back of the diner there's a curtain, and between 6:30 and 7:30 every morning there's a dice game going on, and it's only men. And so the first time I went, a local attorney, who was kind of like the attorney in the county, went with me. And so when I walked through the curtain, I think they were a little flabbergasted because I was probably the first woman who's been back there in a couple of decades. And so they stopped playing dice, who was I, FBI or what? I don't know. And at the end of the game, or at the end of my time, they were really nice to me. At the end of my time, they said, so, do you know how to play ship captain and crew? And I said, yes, I do. So ship captain and crew is a dice game commonly played in Wisconsin, or at least in certain parts of Wisconsin. And you have your dice cup and you get 3 shakes. And you have to shake a 6, a 5, and a 4 in that order. And then your remaining 2 dice determine how high your roll is. And they sit at this L-shaped table. It's like the room's not big enough to put 2 tables end to end, so they put one table here and then another table here. And then they use a little soup cup to pass along the table as they're talking. They're sitting there drinking coffee and shaking dice, and they put their quarter in the soup cup. Well, that's background. Okay, another piece of background is there's a horse auction going on in town this day, and I've known them about 3 years now. I think this is about my third or 4th visit. And I'll use my hands again. I can't remember what we had been talking about, but they start asking me about the horse auction. And Henry says, why don't you buy one of them horses? I got a trailer. Well, I'm not sure where I would keep him. Huh? Well, I'm not sure where I would keep him. Oh, you keep him in Madison. That's where they keep all the bullshit. Right. So that's very funny, and we're playing, and then he also adds in, well, basically all you got to do is buy the front end of the horse. They got the back end in Madison. So I share that with you just to note that, like, a lot of what they're telling me is really sobering. Oftentimes they're talking about people like me, right? And yet oftentimes they're giving it to me in jokes and in a pretty funny way. Well, the problem is I'm playing dice with them this time. Ever since that first visit, I take my little coin purse along, and I'm winning this time, and over and over and over. And the dollar round is coming up, so it's $7.25 instead of a quarter per bet. It's $1, and I'm really disturbed, right? Because I'm 3 years into this work. I know full well at this point, like, they have this sense that, you all from Madison, you come in here and you take all our money and you leave and we never see it in return. So I'm really uncomfortable, despite the fact that should one be gambling with the people that they're studying as a social scientist? Anyway, so I'm a little, should I be doing this? So I'm joking along with them, and I say, so I come and I ask for your thoughts and I take your money, ha ha ha. And Richard says, well, I tell you what, that's good though, because we have so little of it here and it all goes to Madison anyway, right? Ha ha ha. We expect nothing less from Madison. Well, at least it won't cost any postage to get it down there now. Right. So, all right, so I made at least a few of you giggle.
Did you win the dollar round?
No, thank God I didn't. All right, one other thing I want to share with you. When I'm talking about politicians tapping into these perspectives, I want to give you one example of what this sounds like. Sometimes it's really subtle. Sometimes it's hitting us over the head with it, but sometimes it's really subtle. Here's a subtle example from Scott Walker during the 2010 gubernatorial race, and this is during the primary, and it's in the first debate. And an issue that was going on at the time was the sitting governor, the incumbent Jim Doyle, was a Democrat, and he had accepted $810 million from the federal government. He had applied for and accepted to build a high-speed train between Madison and Milwaukee. And Scott Walker on the campaign trail had pledged, if I'm elected, we are not taking that money because, and I'll give you his reason why. This is what he said. If you look at what Jim Doyle and Tom Barrett, that was Walker's eventual opponent, he's a mayor of Milwaukee at the time. If you look at what Jim Doyle and Tom Barrett have put on the table in spending $810 million on a high-speed train line between Milwaukee and Madison, with no assurance that it will go to Eau Claire or La Crosse or anywhere else, it's just about those two areas, Madison and Milwaukee. And it's about taking that money that will cost the citizens of Wisconsin up to $10 million per year, according to their numbers. I think it will actually be much more. That's $10 million that doesn't go to fix the road that goes up from West Salem, through the cutout, up to Black River Falls. It doesn't fix streets in La Crosse. That's money that's taken away from our local roads and our bridges and our other transportation needs today. I think that example is fascinating, both for the way he's kind of pitting those two areas versus the other places in the state that could benefit from that money. But his use of the word our in that last phrase, our local roads, so our doesn't include Madison and Milwaukee, right? Fascinating. All right, back to, so is it economics or is it culture? Is it economics? Is it racism? Well, you might guess at this point, I'm going to say it's both, but I want to explain this carefully. I say it's both because when, in the conversations I've just shared with you, when people are telling me, people like me, we are not getting our fair share, they're both talking about where we are strapped, we're working hard to make ends meet and we can't quite do it, and they are saying to me, we're not getting our fair share and those people are, right? So in that way, it's intertwined to be both. But I do want to share with you, those of you who haven't encountered it, Ta-Nehisi Coates, a writer worth reading these days. And it's constantly, I feel, is constantly giving me reminders about how to think about this, or challenging me, saying things like, well, it's both. Because in a recent essay in The Atlantic, Ta-Nehisi Coates writes this, and he's really writing to folks like me who are saying, well, it's both. The politics of race are themselves never attributable just to the politics of race. So I should back up to say, in that statement of it's both, it's also the statement of, well, it's not just about race, it's also about economic anxiety, right? But Ta-Nehisi Coates is saying, no kidding. But he's saying the politics of race are themselves never attributable just to the politics of race. The history of slavery is also about the growth of international capitalism. The history of lynching must be seen in light of anxiety over the growing independence of women. The civil rights movement can't be disentangled from the Cold War. Thus, to say that the rise of Donald Trump is about more than race is to make an empty statement, one that is small comfort to the people, black, Muslim, immigrant, who live under racism's boot. One other thing I want to touch on, there's just a few more, and I want to open it up to your reactions. I find oftentimes the conversation about populism or about the rise of Scott Walker, or about the rise of Donald Trump, is about what is the deal with those voters? What is the deal with those people? Or what is wrong with those people, right? And I think that sometimes I wonder, is that the most effective question to be asking right now? And I wonder if a more effective question should be, what's wrong with our political elites? Because we were just saying in Professor Winter's class earlier today that the things that I'm describing, these perceptions of not getting my fair share of attention and not getting my fair share of resources or not getting my fair share of respect, those sentiments are not exclusive to people in rural Wisconsin or rural America anywhere, right? Think of all the different parts of our society where we are hearing that from. You might say Black Lives Matter is in general like saying that message, like, you don't know us, you don't understand us, and you don't even like us, right? So the question I think we should be asking is, what is it with our democracy that's making that happen, that's making so many different people in so many different places say that similar kind of thing, like, whatever government is doing is not working for people like me. One final thing. I'm a scholar of public opinion, and when we talk about public opinion, almost automatically we think of public opinion polls, right? And we almost automatically also think of which candidate people are choosing or what their stance is on a given policy. Everything I've just told you is not really about that, right? It's about instead the lenses or the perspectives or the windows that people are using to think about candidates and to think about policy. And that stuff is harder to pick up in public opinion polls. But I hope that after this last presidential election, we now recognize a bit better about how important that stuff is to understanding public opinion. You have to understand how people are seeing the world. Because I know in Madison, Wisconsin, the night of the presidential election, the people around me, my really smart professor friends, right, were saying, how could anybody vote for Donald Trump, right? It's hard to understand unless you understand the way people are understanding, right? It's hard to understand unless you know the lenses people are using to think about the world. So with that, I'll end, and I really look forward to your comments and your questions, and don't feel like you have to ask me a question. If there's something you want to share with the rest of the group, now's a great time to do it. So thank you for your careful attention. Thank you.